Hey guys, tonight we take a featherlight step back in time to ancient China, where the roads are muddy, the sky is the color of steeped tea, and you, yes, you, have just been given the prestigious job of delivering a royal message. With a goose, you're standing ankle deep in puddles outside a Han Dynasty courier station, somewhere along a vast stretch of the Silk Road. Your robes are damp, your sandals squish, in your gloved hand, a tightly rolled scroll. And in the other, tugging against a braided hemp lead, is a goose. Not a sleek military-looking bird, not a majestic swan, a deeply annoyed, slightly cross-eyed goose with no respect for authority. And it's honking, loudly. You probably won't survive this job for long. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. I always love reading those. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Han Dynasty, lasting from 206 BCE to 220 CE, was one of China's golden ages. And like any bureaucracy worth its salt, it ran on paperwork. Official decrees, census reports, military orders, even birthday congratulations to regional governors. Messages flew constantly across the empire. But before paper became widespread or postal systems became standardized, the methods of delivery were, let's call them, experimental. Sure, there were runners and horseback couriers, especially for more official deliveries. But out in the quieter corners of the empire, villages tucked into misty mountain passes, farming communities on riverbanks, a different kind of courier occasionally waddled into service. Enter the goose. You wouldn't think of them as helpful. After all, this is a bird famous for interrupting lakeside picnics and chasing toddlers through petting zoos. But the Han Chinese had their reasons. For one, geese are fiercely territorial and nearly impossible to ignore. That honking? Turns out it's great for announcing the arrival of a message, even from a distance. They're also incredibly loyal. Once bonded to a handler or a route, they tend to return reliably, at least as reliably as a goose can. Historians still argue whether the goose mail system was a widespread practice or more of a quirky rural workaround. Some suggest it began with farmers repurposing livestock for messenger duty when horse access was limited. Others think it may have been ritualistic, part postal, part symbolic, with the goose representing vigilance or divine attention. One tale from a southern province even describes geese being released with love notes tied to their legs, often flying straight to their original owners, tragically if unintentionally delivering proof of infidelity. In any case, the Han Dynasty was an era of infrastructural ambition. Roads were built, canals were dredged, and borders expanded faster than a palace banquet menu. Communication needed to keep up. That meant using everything from runners and smoke signals to, yes, trained birds. The climate helped. Much of the Han heartland was crisscrossed with rivers and lakes, ideal terrain for birds already adapted to aquatic landscapes. A goose could fly over flooded paddies, meander downstream, or just walk its own strange path between villages. It wasn't the fastest system, but it worked, sort of. When it didn't, the goose was usually eaten and a fresh one trained. Let's rewind a bit. Picture yourself not as the unlucky courier, but as a Han scribe sitting in a government hall in Chang'an. Your job, writing messages on silk. Paper's still a luxury item here, and rolling them up into watertight tubes sealed with lacquer. Once ready, you slip the tube into a tiny harness fitted around a goose's chest. You pat the bird's head, it bites your thumb, walk outside and let it go. It flaps off, unimpressively, and disappears over the city walls. Does it make it to the recipient? That's a question you'll never get an answer to. There were, of course, more practical systems. Relay stations every 10 to 20 miles allowed mounted couriers to swap horses and rest. But the goose? The goose was for when you didn't have access to those. For the sleepy fishing village nestled between reed-filled marshes and distant tea farms. Places a horse couldn't reach and a runner didn't care to visit. To truly appreciate this system, you have to imagine the pace of it. You're not in a world of emails or buzzing phones. You're in a place where messages take days or weeks, where rivers flood and roads vanish in rain. A single message, even carried by a reliable bird, might drift into fog and never return. Yet somehow, across decades and dynasties, it worked often enough to persist. Goosemail probably never moved military secrets or imperial decrees. But for gossip between provinces, for poetry contests between reclusive monks, for a recipe passed from one grandmother to another, it was perfect. You can still find references to goose dispatches in ancient texts, though the term might be metaphorical. One poem describes the arrival of a white messenger over the lake, bringing sorrowful news from home. Another, from the eastern Han, jokes about a goose who stopped halfway to flirt with a riverbank duck. Let's not forget the weather. Rain could render couriers completely useless, but geese? Geese love it. Nothing pleases a goose more than slogging through a downpour, honking with smug superiority as humans curse the skies. That's why some remote regions in southern China trained whole flocks to deliver simple messages like fish ready or market moved or bandits nearby. You sit by your window now, watching one such goose disappear into the mist. It's not fast, it flaps low and wobbles. You're not even sure it's heading in the right direction. But in a few days, someone miles away may lift their head to the sound of approaching wings and smile at the absurd but functional magic of it all. You wake up early the next morning, your straw mat still warm from sleep, and step outside into the cool hush of dawn. The sky's the soft gray of washed rice paper. Off in the distance, a faint honking drifts across the still air, either a morning delivery or someone's breakfast getting loose. Either way, it's the sound of messages on the move. In the Han Dynasty, communication didn't follow schedules like ours do now. There was no 8 a.m. mail drop or delivered at your door guarantee. Messages arrived when they arrived, by runner, by rider, or, in more eccentric cases, via web-footed courier. You didn't question it. You accepted that news moved at the speed of wind, road conditions, and animal temperament. You walk past the village pond where a few local children are chasing after a goose wearing a tiny saddle-like pouch. It flaps indignantly and takes off just high enough to hover over their heads, smug as ever. One child points and says, "It's going to Auntie Lee again." Apparently, that particular goose is known for delivering herbal recipes across 3 rice paddies in a bamboo grove. While most of this is charming, the Han court took communications very seriously. The bureaucracy had roots in Confucian ideals: order, hierarchy, ritual, which meant information had to flow upward and downward without too much chaos. Goosemail, while never officially part of the imperial relay system, still fit into this larger cultural fabric. It was local, informal, but incredibly human, born of improvisation and necessity. Historians still argue whether Goose Post ever held legal recognition or was more folklore than fact. Some say it started in the wetter provinces where rivers were more navigable than roads. Others believe it was a kind of postal folklore, a story told to illustrate the ingenuity, or the absurdity, of rural officials. A few dusty administrative records mention avian-assisted delivery, but scholars debate whether these referred to actual birds or were poetic nicknames for unreliable human messengers. And yet, a small carved stone unearthed near Chengdu appears to depict a goose in flight, carrying something ribbon-tied beneath its belly. The carving is simple, the detail vague, but to a certain school of archaeologists, it's confirmation. To others, it's a goose with indigestion. Still, you can't help but imagine it. A village elder tying a message, maybe a warning about a coming flood or the date of the next moon festival, carefully onto the neck or side of a goose. The bird, already used to flying back and forth between 2 watering holes, takes off into the gray sky like a sleepy postal worker who never asked for this job. And geese are surprisingly clever. Not as sharp as crows, sure, but trainable. Han farmers already use them as guard animals. Yes, that was a thing, since their honks could alert households to intruders. Why not tack on an additional role? You move past a shed where old baskets of millet are stacked and see an elderly man squatting, feeding a small gaggle of messenger geese. He points to one with a nick in its beak and says, "That one? Got lost for 4 days. Came back with another goose and a fish." There's no telling if he's serious, but in this timeline, you accept it as gospel. There's humor here, but also a sort of sleepy resilience. When people didn't have the infrastructure, they made do. When roads washed out or couriers fell ill, geese didn't mind. Rain? No problem. Mud? Not an issue. Wolves? Well, okay, sometimes that was a problem. By the way, geese were never trained to fight off predators, despite what one particularly optimistic village legend claims. The idea of a lone goose outwitting a mountain cat to deliver a grain tax invoice is sadly wishful thinking. But the Han people loved stories, parables, fables, anecdotes to keep their evenings interesting. And so the myth persisted. Somewhere out there, an entire folk ballad exists about a heroic goose named Jin Jin, who crossed rivers, dodged slingshots, and brought news of victory during a bandit raid. That's the other thing. A lot of this communication wasn't just paperwork. It was emotional. Birth announcements, requests for help, letters between separated siblings. Not everything in history is about emperors and generals. Most of life happened in the in-between spaces, on dirt paths between fields, on riverbanks, in quiet villages where people figured out how to stay connected with whatever tools they had. You follow a dirt path now, shaded by bamboo, as a goose struts confidently ahead of you like it knows exactly where it's going. And maybe it does. Maybe it's walked this path so many times it could find its way blindfolded. Maybe someone's waiting for that bird a few kilometers away, hands dusty from grinding millet, eager to unwrap a scroll that simply says, "The ducks have hatched. Bring vinegar." Quirky? Absolutely, but that's the point. History isn't always grand battles and palace coups. Sometimes it's a middle-aged farmer carefully brushing goose feathers so the message doesn't snag. Or a girl sneaking a love note into a goose's harness and hoping it flies faster than her parents' disapproval. And here's a final nugget for this stretch of our sleepy tale. In some Han medical texts, goose feathers were believed to have cooling properties when soaked in tea. It's unclear if this belief extended to the postal birds, but we can imagine a time when a fevered patient received both a prescription and the means to deliver it on the wings of a goose. By mid-morning, you're walking alongside a trickling irrigation canal, toes sinking slightly into the muddy edge. Somewhere to your left, someone is banging a wooden bell, maybe to call workers back from their rest break, or maybe to scare off birds from the bean crops. But not all birds, of course. The working geese are still on duty. This particular village, nestled in the folds of what's now southwestern China, seems to have developed its own style of avian correspondence. You pass a courtyard where a young boy and his grandfather are adjusting a series of bamboo poles and red strings, a sort of tiny obstacle course for their birds. The old man explains without looking up, if they can walk the beam, they can fly the route. Logical? Debatable, but delightful? Absolutely. As far as we know, goose mail in the Han Dynasty was never widespread enough to replace the official relay stations, the structured network of inns and horse stables dotting the empire. That system, the Yichuan, was fast, relatively reliable, and backed by serious government funding. Riders could cover up to 50 miles a day, switching horses at each stop, delivering urgent messages for the emperor and his officials. But the goose system wasn't trying to compete. It existed in the quiet margins, filling a niche that government couriers could never really reach: the deeply personal and the hyper-local. Messages about a neighbor's wedding, a shipment of pickled mustard greens gone missing, or an apology scrawled after borrowing someone's ox without asking. Small things, but small things mattered, and geese had advantages. You didn't need a road, you didn't have to pay them beyond a few handfuls of grain, and crucially, they could fly over terrain that would slow even the best horseback courier: ravines, rice paddies, flooded fields, and dense groves. Historians still argue whether goose routes were ever formally mapped out. Some point to a faded piece of bamboo slip correspondence found in an ancient well outside Changsha. It includes a list of names and village symbols, followed by curious notations like fastest if flying past East Gate Willow, and avoid field near Old Temple, aggressive dogs. These, some argue, are early route instructions. Not for humans, but for geese. Others think it's more likely a farmer's note for his nephew. Honestly, it could be both. There are no official training manuals for goose couriers, but folk traditions give us some hints. The birds were often raised in pairs and conditioned from a young age to walk or fly between specific locations. Grain rewards were doled out at both ends, and yes, the birds sometimes refused to leave until properly coaxed. One local tale warns, never send a goose without first complimenting its plumage, otherwise it'll sulk mid-air. You duck under a woven reed archway as the path narrows, passing an elderly woman scraping dried mud off a tiny message gourd. Instead of using scrolls, some households tucked messages inside these little hollowed squashes. Lighter than parchment and naturally waterproof, if slightly awkward for the bird to carry. Think of it as the Han version of a bubble-wrapped envelope. The woman sees you eyeing the gourd and chuckles. My mother once tied a love poem inside one of these. The goose came back a week later. No reply, just an acorn shoved inside. She married someone else. So yes, goose mail didn't always guarantee a happy ending. There's something endearing about all this low-tech genius. The Han Dynasty had paper, ink, and sophisticated administrative systems. But in the rural corners, innovation looked different. It looked like geese with tiny fabric harnesses sewn by hand. It looked like grandmothers sketching maps in the dirt with chopsticks. It looked like people adapting, not because they were ordered to, but because it made life work better. And geese, for their part, adapted too. Some learned to fly longer routes. Others got picky about which direction they preferred to fly in. A few became semi-celebrities. One was reportedly honored with a red ribbon collar after delivering a letter across 2 counties during monsoon season. You won't find it in the official records, but that goose lived in luxury until it passed, probably from overeating fermented soybeans. Now, some folks today like to ask, but how could they make sure the goose would fly to the right place? And that's fair. Birds aren't GPS equipped. But here's the thing. Most goose routes were repetitive. They didn't deliver to 20 different villages. They did 1 or 2 loops. Think of them as biological courier drones running pre-programmed routines. And like modern tech, they occasionally crashed into trees. One fringe theory, still hotly debated among goose mail enthusiasts, yes, those exist, suggests that certain geese were trained using scent trails, like dogs. Scented claws from the destination were hung near the home pen, helping the bird home in on the smell. Others argue geese simply followed landmarks and got really good at winging it. Either way, you can't deny the results. You pause at a tiny bridge where someone has painted a smiling goose in red ink on the side beam. It has the look of an unofficial local mascot. Below the drawing, in almost perfect calligraphy, is a poem. Feathered wings above rice plains, scrolls of gossip, love or rains. Not swift as horse nor wise as crow, but faithful still where soft winds blow. And really, that's the spirit of it all. Goose mail wasn't flawless. It was slow. It was occasionally unpredictable, but it was real. It stitched together people and places in a way that felt almost magical, if only because it was so absurdly sincere. You continue along the canal path, the scent of fermented tofu wafting through the air from a nearby kitchen. And above you, a goose honks once, sharply, before disappearing into the afternoon haze. Perhaps off to deliver a recipe, a joke, or a quiet reminder that sometimes the best messengers are the ones who don't take themselves too seriously. The afternoon sun softens as you follow a dirt road, weaving through fields of wheat and mulberry trees. Along the way, a farmer leans against a wooden cart loaded with freshly woven silk bolts. He smiles and tells you about the importance of the silk routes in connecting faraway lands, not just with merchants and caravans, but with ideas, inventions, and even postal innovations like the geese you met earlier. You might imagine those famous silk routes as bustling highways of camels and traders, But beneath that grand image lies a patchwork of slower, quieter channels, secret shortcuts, mountain paths, and coastal trails where messages sometimes traveled by bird or boat instead of man or beast. Silk itself wasn't just fabric, it was a medium of communication. Some letters were written on silk scrolls, especially for important officials or lovers who wanted their messages to feel precious and lasting. Silk's smooth surface made ink flow differently, adding an almost calligraphic dance to every character. And it was durable, meaning a message carried by goose or courier could survive damp weather or rough handling, better than paper in many cases. You pause by a small shrine dedicated to the goddess of communication, who locals swear watches over lost messages and misbehaving geese alike. The goddess's statue holds a delicate scroll and a goose feather, symbolizing the blend of written word and winged delivery. Historians still argue whether the Silk Route's impact was mostly economic or cultural, but here in these fields you feel their magic was something else. A patient weaving of lives across thousands of miles, stitched together by every letter and parcel, whether sent by camel, courier, or feathered friend. A gentle breeze ruffles the leaves as you think about how this ancient system parallels our modern internet. Connections that cross vast distances, carrying stories, secrets, and sometimes even silly poems. As dusk settles, you hear the distant honk of geese gathering for the night, their silhouettes against a soft, pink sky, reminding you that even in the vastness of history, small, simple acts, like sending a letter by bird, can feel intimately human. You wake the next morning with the gentle clatter of a wooden gate swinging open nearby. A messenger boy is preparing to release a small gaggle of geese from their pen, each bird adorned with a tiny leather pouch strapped carefully around its neck. The air smells faintly of rice wine and wood smoke, mingling with the crisp freshness of dew-soaked fields. These birds are about to embark on their daily flight, carrying messages across the sprawling Han countryside, and you watch as the oldest goose, distinguished by a faded blue ribbon tied loosely around one leg, flaps its wings with deliberate grace. This is the lead goose, trained to set the pace and direction, with younger, less experienced birds following close behind. You walk beside the messenger, who explains that the geese aren't just random flyers online, they have preferred routes honed over months, sometimes years. The birds remember landmarks, ancient cypress trees, a crooked bridge, the curve of a winding river. They're like feathered cartographers charting their way through a living map. Historians still argue whether the Han Dynasty's use of geese for mailing was widespread, or mostly a quaint rural custom. Some believe it was mainly used by small villages cut off from the official relay system, while others suggest it was a playful, occasional method rather than a serious communication channel. Whatever the truth, the idea itself brings a smile, a reminder of human ingenuity meeting nature's gifts. You watch the birds lift off, their wings beating rhythmically as they slice through the morning light. One bird veers slightly off course, perhaps distracted by a tempting patch of wild berries below, but soon righting itself, it vanishes over the distant hills. As you return to the village, you notice that the messages inside those tiny pouches come in many forms. Delicate scrolls wrapped in silk, small carved bamboo tablets, even painted fans with coded designs. Each message carries not only words but a sense of urgency, care, and connection. Later, sitting beside a fire as evening falls, you reflect on how this system echoes modern communications challenges: reliability, speed, and trust. Just like today's texts and emails, sometimes messages were delayed, lost, or misunderstood. And sometimes the journey itself mattered more than the message. You find yourself wandering down a sloping path that leads to the edge of a reed-filled marsh. The soft squelch of the earth under your sandals is oddly satisfying, and the occasional croak of frogs provides a soundtrack to your steps. This wetland, you're told, serves as a key stopover for messenger geese, a kind of feathery post office with wings and webbed feet. Here, a wiry old man tends to a modest sanctuary, part rest stop, part training ground. He's a former courier himself, now retired and fully dedicated to avian literacy, as he calls it with a proud grin. Around him, geese preen, waddle, and honk, their pouches hanging neatly from hooks in a row of miniature wooden lockers. The whole place feels like a whimsical blend of birdhouse and bureaucracy. The man explains how training began young. Geese were raised with gentle human contact, learning to associate specific smells. Jasmine oil for one village, sandalwood for another, with destinations. Flight routes were practiced in short loops at first, gradually extended as the geese proved themselves. He taps a gnarled finger against a polished gourd and says, "Patience is the only thing faster than wings." You sit on a flat rock beside the water and watch a demonstration. A younger goose, newly saddled with a small scroll, is released and flutters up, only to circle awkwardly and land again with an indignant honk. The old man chuckles. "Still afraid of clouds, that one." Not every bird made the cut. Some were too excitable, too curious, or just plain moody. "You ever tried convincing a goose it wants to go to work?" he asks. You nod, solemnly, as if understanding the woes of poultry management on a deep, emotional level. Historians still debate whether geese were truly capable of long-distance message delivery or were simply used within short-range rural networks. The lack of consistent written records makes it difficult to determine. And perhaps, like many oddities in history, the truth lies somewhere between practicality and performance art. Still, the evidence of geese used for ceremonial messages, festival invitations, and love letters is difficult to ignore. Geese were often featured in Han pottery and paintings, sometimes flying with ribbons or scrolls, their images etched in lacquerware and immortalized in murals. You trail your hand through the water and think, this mixture of myth, memory, and mud is what makes history feel alive. Whether or not the geese could read return addresses, they certainly knew where home was. And sometimes that's all you need. As the sun lowers behind the hills, a flight of trained geese takes off in unison, wings glinting gold in the late light. Their shadows ripple across the water surface like ancient handwriting, fluid and fleeting. As twilight stretches across the Han landscape, you find yourself invited to a small gathering inside a bamboo courtyard house, the home of a local scribe and his family. A red paper lantern swings lazily above the entryway, and the courtyard smells of plum wine and simmered duck. You remove your sandals at the threshold, stepping onto cool, smooth tiles. Inside, the scribe unrolls a long piece of parchment. He's preparing several letters, each destined for different villages. You notice his calligraphy, graceful, looping, and more art than writing. He dips his brush into ink made from pine soot and rainwater, explaining that a message is only as good as its legibility. Smudged script, he says, is like mumbling through a door. As you sit cross-legged beside him, he reveals a small drawer filled with wax seals, fragrant papers, and tiny jade weights. Some letters are wrapped with dried flowers for scent tracking. Others are inked with riddles. Not for secrecy, but as tokens of affection. A goose may not understand love poems, but it will carry them just the same. He tells you about the unofficial Geese Courier's Code, a playful but oddly practical set of traditions. Never send a goose out before its morning bath, never strap a pouch to a bird that hasn't eaten, and always, always offer thanks upon delivery, preferably with a clean tub and a bowl of millet. The scribe's daughter, no more than 8, climbs onto your lap and shows you a miniature scroll. Her first letter, addressed to her grandmother 2 villages over. It's just a drawing of a goose with little hearts around it. You smile. Clearly, the message will get through. Historians still argue whether the written messages carried by Han geese were standardized in any way. Did they follow a known protocol, or were they casual, improvised tools for private communication? No imperial edict survives that officially outlines goose post policy, but anecdotal records mention its use in festivals and matchmaking, where a particularly well-trained bird might deliver a painted fan to one household, only to return with a box of tea leaves and a subtle yes. You ask the scribe if any goose ever went rogue, flew the wrong way, joined a wild flock, or simply retired mid-flight. He nods. It happens. One flew west and ended up with a family who thought it was a sign from their ancestors. He grins. Became a minor household deity. They still burn incense to it. You sip warm chrysanthemum tea while the last scroll is tied neatly and slipped into a goose pouch. The bird waits patiently at the door, tapping one foot like an impatient postman. It's a scene of serene absurdity, a reminder that bureaucracy doesn't always need walls. And when the bird finally takes flight, lifting into the indigo sky, you feel an odd sense of trust. Not in the speed of the delivery, but in its inevitability. Messages, like water, find their way. You awaken to the quiet flap of wings. Morning mist coils low over the paddies, and from your vantage atop a small hill, you spot a pair of geese gliding down onto a tiled roof. One of them wears a tiny red pouch, strapped just beneath its downy breast. The other, unburdened, honks at a chicken. Neither appears particularly hurried. Your guide today is a postal steward. Not a lofty government official, but a kind of regional organizer tasked with coordinating messages between towns. He wears hemp robes dyed in faded indigo, and he carries a bamboo staff not for walking, but for pointing at maps and tapping inattentive geese. They don't like being scolded, he tells you with a shrug, but sometimes they need a reminder. He leads you along a well-worn trail between hamlets, where you pass crude signposts painted with characters and symbols. One features the crude outline of a goose beside a pine tree, the mark of an informal feather stop, a local household that agrees to house, feed, and redirect message-carrying birds. These stops aren't official post stations. They're part of what you might call the gray market of Han communication, operating with the Empire's quiet approval but built on personal favor and neighborly reputation. Along the way, your guide explains the intricate coordination needed to maintain even the most modest regional goose routes. Birds were often trained in pairs, one acting as the lead flyer, the other as a backup. A kind of avian wingman, literally. If one veered off, the other might coax it back. Goose loyalty, he says with a chuckle. Better than some husbands. He tells you about one old bird named Pillow, who reportedly flew the same three-village loop for over 10 years without missing a delivery. Pillow was celebrated at local festivals and once honored with a tiny carved gravestone when she finally passed. Died of boredom, they say. As you stop at a village for midday tea, you learn more about how these feathered couriers were factored into daily life. Children were often responsible for feeding them, an early lesson in responsibility. Young couples tied love notes to the birds in hopes they'd reach the right window. Farmers traded seasonal planting tips through the winged network, and healers used them to spread herbal advice when local plagues broke out. Of course, not everyone trusted the system. One elderly scholar, his beard a waterfall of white, grumbles over his rice bowl that no bird should be entrusted with a poem. You nod sympathetically. Perhaps he once sent a verse that never reached its destination. Yet even skeptics acknowledge that in a world without mobile phones or even horses for commoners, goosemail offered something invaluable: connection. No matter how small your farm, how humble your town, you could write a thought, roll it in silk, and trust that somewhere out there, flapping across the rice wind, your words were traveling. Historians still debate how far these informal goose networks extended. Some believe they were strictly provincial, confined to specific river valley systems. Others argue for a broader, more organic lattice of villages, towns, and farms, bonded less by imperial decree and more by communal rhythm. Archaeological evidence is slim, of course. Most pouches and notes have long since dissolved into the earth, but there are fragments, a bit of red ribbon unearthed near a now-vanished farmstead, a bronze weight shaped like a peach pit. And somewhere in a private collection, a bamboo slip etched with what seems to be a weather forecast addressed to Uncle Ping, tell the sweet potatoes to brace themselves. By the time you return to the steward's modest hut, the sun is low. He lights a small lamp and shows you a ledger where he's recorded every flight from his village this month. 37 outbound, 35 confirmed arrivals. 2 are still in the wind, as he puts it. And just as you're wondering whether those 2 birds will ever return, there's a soft thump on the bamboo roof. A long pause. Then, a honk. You pause outside the hut, neck craned toward the rooftop. There's a rhythmic shuffle of claws on bamboo, and then another honk, louder this time, like a grumpy neighbor reminding you they've been waiting. Your host sighs with a kind of amused exasperation, sets aside his tea, and climbs a short wooden ladder. Moments later, he reappears with a soot-streaked goose tucked under one arm and a tiny scroll in his free hand. "This one always takes the scenic route," he mutters. The scroll, it turns out, is not urgent. It contains a recipe for plum wine and an addendum about which neighbor borrowed a certain mortar and never returned it. But that's the charm of these messages. They're not grand edicts or battlefield strategies. They're deeply, exquisitely mundane. As you sit beneath the eaves and nibble sweet rice cakes, your steward friend recounts some of the strangest messages ever flown in by geese. One scroll listed nothing but varieties of melons, written vertically in meticulous calligraphy. Another contained a marriage proposal to 3 different recipients, sparking what he calls a love triangle that flew in literal circles. There's a lingering question that floats gently on the night air. Why geese at all? Historians still argue whether geese were genuinely chosen for their navigational skills, or if their popularity owed more to availability than aptitude. Some scholars argue ducks would have done just as well, and possibly with fewer personality issues, but weren't as common in certain inland areas. Others believe geese were favored because they imprint easily, allowing handlers to develop strong directional training with simple methods and persistent bribery via snacks. There's even an old Han proverb that says, "Train a goose young and it will never forget your roof," which sounds touching until you remember that geese also hold lifelong grudges. The reality is that geese, for all their noisiness and occasional airheaded diversions, were surprisingly consistent over short to mid-range routes. They flew low and returned home with minimal prompting, especially when homes included cozy nesting spots and regular servings of barley. And while they weren't fast, not compared to horse riders on urgent imperial business, they were predictable, which in an era of mudslides and bandits was its own kind of miracle. You ask whether geese were ever used for more official duties. Your steward raises an eyebrow and leans closer. "Sometimes," he whispers, "we'd slip them coded slips. Only a few knew how to read them. Just names or numbers, nothing obvious." These weren't messages from generals or governors, but rather from lower-level bureaucrats trying to shuffle information under the radar. Tax tallies, land disputes, warnings about bandit movements. Quiet things, sent quietly. You get the sense that this part of Goosemail lived in a gray fog between sanctioned and subversive. The Empire knew it happened, maybe even tolerated it, but it was never written into law and certainly never commemorated on any stele. That ambiguity suited the geese just fine. You spend the evening watching the birds settle into their coops, which resemble miniature pagodas, each carved with the character for home. Inside, a few older geese coo softly, their heads tucked beneath one wing. Others blink at you, clearly unconvinced that your presence improves their routine. One of the younger birds, still speckled gray with adolescence, waddles up to your sandal and pecks it experimentally. "That one's a wanderer," the steward says with a chuckle. "She'll fly halfway to the coast just to chase a fish shadow." Still, he'll train her, slowly, with patience and grain and long walks around the village perimeter. Eventually, she'll carry slips like the others. Maybe she'll even find her rhythm, and when she does, Some sleepy farmer a valley away might unwrap her tiny scroll and smile at the weather forecast, or the birthday poem, or the urgent note that says, "Bring pickled radish next time." The moon is up now, and the steward hands you a blanket. "Sleep here if you like," he says, "but don't snore too loud. The birds hate that." You stretch out beneath the stars, tucked between clucking wings and the scent of straw and lamp oil, and as your eyelids drift low, you wonder how many of your own messages have ever truly flown home. Your dreams were odd. Bits of parchment tied to your toes, honking deadlines, and a goose in a scholar's hat demanding taxes. But morning in the Han countryside is cool and soft, and you're woken not by alarms, but by the shuffling of feet and the gentle thunk of bamboo coops being opened. The geese understandably look less majestic by daylight. Their feathers are rumpled, their eyes squint in the morning sun, and more than a few seem to regret every life decision that led them here. Still, as the steward sprinkles feed, a quiet sense of purpose returns. They stretch their wings, mutter to themselves, and prepare for the day's dispatches. You follow the steward to a squat little building, part shed, part shrine, known locally as the Letter House. It's where villagers drop off notes and scrolls to be assigned a goose-bound destination. The walls are papered with records, arrival times, feeding logs, and yes, even disciplinary notes for misbehaving birds. One entry reads simply, "Honked at the magistrate." No rice for 2 days. Today's outgoing mail includes a grandmother's warning to her daughter about river spirits, a short verse meant to woo a blacksmith, and a complaint about a neighbor's singing during market hours. A noise-related conflict, funnily enough, being solved by even noisier couriers. But perhaps the most touching scroll is one you're asked to carry, or rather to watch be carried. It's from a boy of about 10, and the calligraphy is wobbly but proud. The message? "Dear uncle, I miss you. Please send stories. The goose is nice." It's rolled up and slipped into a waxed bamboo tube, which is then tied with gentle precision to the leg of a particularly serene-looking bird. You help open the coop. With a polite honk, the goose waddles to the garden path, flaps once, twice, and lifts off in a low arc across the valley. The steward watches her go and mutters, "She won't rush." But she'll get there. The image stays with you. A boy's longing made flight, drifting on slow wings across a patchwork of farms and forests. It's the most gentle kind of mail, not urgent, not transactional, but heartfelt, like an echo asking for a reply. You ask about return messages and how the geese know where to go next. That's when you learn about the relay system, a kind of ancient version of forwarding mail. Geese weren't expected to do multi-city hops. Instead, partner villages raised their own flocks and exchanged birds regularly. Each community had a few return specialists. Geese trained to fly home after a delivery, usually to a particular handler. You're shown a crude but charming map drawn on reed paper with tiny goose symbols marking the flight paths between villages. Most routes are less than 20 li, about 10 kilometers. Some are even shorter. The longest one, marked in red ink, is noted simply as one-time trip, goose retired. There's something deeply human and goose-like about the whole system. It's not sleek, it's not scalable, but it works in its own feathered way. Letters may arrive a little crumpled. Ink might smudge from rain, but arrive they do, with a wing flap and a honk and a small thump on your thatched roof. One scholar you meet, pale robes, ink-stained fingers, and eyes that look like they haven't blinked since the last dynasty, claims the goosemail system is a metaphor for life itself. Think of it, he says. Slow, unpredictable, honks at the wrong moments, but always somehow finds the way back. You're about to respond when a goose strolls in and deposits a scroll directly onto the mat between you. It's addressed to the scholar. He unrolls it with solemn gravity, reads, and then sighs. They sent pickled mustard instead of salted plums, he says, as if mourning a lost empire. Even misdeliveries have a place in this world. Sometimes they result in new friendships, unexpected recipes, or spontaneous poetry competitions. There's even a tale of two lonely widowers in different villages whose repeated goose-mail mistakes eventually turned into courtship. Now they live together with 3 geese and 6 grandchildren. And the birds? They don't seem to mind. Whether it's gossip or government, flirtations or food lists, a scroll is a scroll. As long as they get their barley afterward, they're happy to play their part in history's slowest, fluffiest postal service. The steward hands you another scroll, blank this time. For you, he says, write something to send home. You hesitate. What would you say? That you followed a bird across a dynasty? That you met people who trusted wings more than roads? That the most precious things don't travel fast, but true? Instead, you simply write, arrived safely. Still listening. And when you tie it to the young goose's leg, the wanderer from last night, she pauses, preens a bit, then trots to the edge of the coop. With a flap and a honk that sounds like a shrug, she takes to the air. You blink slowly, watching the goose disappear over the ridge. There's something oddly satisfying about it, like mailing a secret wish and trusting the clouds to carry it. Behind you, the village is waking up properly now. Smoke curls from clay chimneys, and somewhere nearby, a rooster is aggressively overselling the sunrise. The steward offers you a bowl of warm millet porridge, dotted with pickled radish and, of course, a stray goose feather floating serenely on top. As you sip, you ask the inevitable question, who thought of this goose-mail idea in the first place? The steward grins. Ah, he says, now we must visit the archives. Which, in this case, turns out to be an elderly woman with an extremely long memory and an even longer queue of cats. She's perched on a stool outside her home, shelling beans and lecturing a ginger Tom about manners. When she hears your question, she waves you over with a bean pod. They say it began during the reign of Emperor Wu, she begins, squinting at the sky as though checking her mental calendar. But historians still argue whether it started with him or earlier, possibly during the interregnum before the Han properly consolidated power. You nod solemnly, trying not to sneeze from all the cat dander. Legend says, she continues, that an official in the southern provinces was faced with a conundrum. Couriers couldn't get through due to floods. Roads were swallowed. But he noticed that the village geese still flew to neighboring ponds day after day. Now, whether this tale is true or not, no one knows. There's a version where the official ties a love letter to a goose in desperation. Another where he bribes the birds with fermented rice and they become loyal as war horses. A third version, told only in taverns, suggests the first goose mail message was a recipe for eel stew that won a cooking contest and a small land dispute in one go. Whatever the truth, the woman shrugs, it caught on. Not for big government matters, mind you, but for local stuff, personal letters, friendly insults, the things you can't send by drumbeat. You lean in, intrigued by that last bit. Drumbeat? She nods. Before goosemail, there were gongs and drums, coded messages relayed between towers. Good for enemy coming, not so good for your aunt forgives you. It's a great point. You imagine someone trying to apologize via rhythmic pounding. Boom, boom, boom. Sorry for ruining the dumplings. And it just doesn't land right. So the geese filled a gap, somewhere between the urgency of war signals and the grandeur of imperial edicts. They made space for small emotions, local knowledge, and neighborly nonsense. For the first time in Han China, letters weren't just top-down. They went sideways, across communities, between friends, around gossip circles. One official report from a southern prefecture, now carefully preserved under cat-guarded silk, mentions a 92% delivery confidence among trained geese. Not bad for creatures with no pockets, poor eyesight, and a tendency to stop for puddles. But the system wasn't just about wing power, it required people. Handlers, trainers, scribes. Each goose had a sort of passport, a name. sometimes poetic, sometimes wildly inappropriate, and a preferred route. Some preferred flying by moonlight, others were strictly morning birds. One infamous gander, known only as General Honk, refused to land until someone played a bamboo flute. His rider notes are now a prized collectible among avian historians. As the old woman talks, you notice the villagers passing by. Some wave, one child offers a flower, another simply honks at you and runs off laughing. You feel, in a strange way, inducted into this peculiar feathered fraternity. You learn that geese were sometimes honored for their service. Retired birds might live out their days near temples or pondside tea houses, occasionally receiving visitors. One such goose, a white-feathered elder named Inkblot, was said to bow whenever someone read aloud. Whether this was a learned habit or sheer coincidence is unclear, but the town swore by it, and if a goose passed away during service, they weren't eaten. That would be unthinkable. Instead, they were often commemorated in local poems or given soft burial mounds near the rivers they'd flown. Tiny stone markers, shaped like feathers, mark the spot. The woman hands you a tiny ink drawing before you go. 2 geese in flight, one with a scroll in its beak. Tell people, she says, they weren't just messengers. They were part of the message. You tuck the drawing into your sleeve, thinking how history is rarely grand and sweeping from up close. More often, it's small and soft-footed, like a goose trotting through dewy grass, carrying someone's joy or grief in a bamboo scroll case. Before you return to the steward, you pause by a group of young trainees watching the sky. They're learning to read goose flight patterns, predicting turns, altitude, even weather shifts based on wing angles. It's part science, part superstition. One of them, a girl with ink on her nose, says, "That one's heading north-northwest, probably toward Plum Orchard Village. They had a wedding last week." How does she know? Weddings always lead to more letters, usually thank you scrolls, or questions about who fainted and why. You laugh and she smiles. Geese know everything, she adds with a wink. And in that moment, as another bird crests the ridge, scroll fluttering, you start to believe it. The steward leads you down a path that's narrower now, softer underfoot. It winds between willows and terraced paddies, their glassy waters reflecting the milky afternoon light. You're not entirely sure where you're going anymore, but at this point, you've accepted that goose-based postal systems aren't the strangest part of your day. You soon arrive at a modest clay-walled structure with a reed roof and a faded sign above the lintel that reads, very simply, "The Nest." Inside, it's quieter than any place you've been today. No geese honking, no chatter. Just the faint scratch of brush on paper and the smell of damp parchment. This is where the letters end up. Stacks of bamboo tubes lie on woven mats, each tagged with tiny calligraphy labels. Some are waiting to be sent back. Others, worn with age, are simply archived. A man with enormous eyebrows nods politely, his hand still moving with practiced rhythm as he transcribes one scroll onto silk paper. You're told he's the village's letter keeper, half historian, half therapist. You peek at one of the messages. It's nothing grand. Just a man telling his sister that the carp pond finally thawed, and he's caught something with eyes too judgmental to eat. You smile. It's intimate. Lovely. The kind of sentiment that doesn't make it into textbooks, but somehow tells you everything. The steward explains, this system was never about speed. It was about connection. Writing was slow. Delivery was slower. But somehow that made people more careful with their words. You nod, thinking how strange and wonderful that is. In a world of chaos and court intrigue, here were people trusting animals with the job of carrying love, news, apologies, and occasionally recipes that may or may not start small fires. Of course, not everything went smoothly. One goose reportedly landed mid-market and got distracted by melon rinds. Another flew west for 3 days, only to return with someone else's scroll. Wrong pond, the note read. Pretty mountains, though. There were mix-ups, rewrites, apologies, But the letter keeper assures you that more often than not, the messages arrived. Or they didn't, and people simply wrote again. The act of writing, it seems, was half the point. A curious boy asks if you've written a letter yet. You shake your head. He hands you a slip of mulberry paper and a dull brush. Don't worry, he whispers. Geese don't judge handwriting. So, you write. Something simple. A message to no one and everyone. You write about the way the rice fields shimmer. About the old woman and her cats. About a place where birds are trusted with words. And then, with surprising ceremony, the boy rolls your note into a scroll and slides it into a tiny bamboo sheath. Your goose apparently is waiting. She's a little squat, with a freckled beak and a skeptical expression, like she's delivered far too many breakup notes in her lifetime. But she stands patiently while the scroll is tied. Someone gives her a pep talk. Then she's off, wings beating against the humid air, disappearing toward the trees. And just like that, your words are flying through ancient China. You sit for a while watching others come and go. A teenage boy sends off a list of jokes he's made up. An older woman posts a recipe involving dried lotus seeds and uncomfortably spicy mustard. A small child asks the goose to deliver a drawing of a house to the clouds. The letter keeper smiles. We don't always know where the messages go, but the act of sending them, that's the magic. Some historians claim this entire goose mail tradition is exaggerated, that while birds were kept and admired in villages, their role in communications was minimal. Others argue that certain military outposts did, in fact, use trained birds for confidential correspondence. One scholar insists that an imperial concubine once sent a secret message via goose that changed the course of a succession crisis, though the only evidence is a fragment of bamboo in a dramatic poem. Still, whether myth or memory, the tradition persists in these quiet corners, and today, you're part of it. You wander back toward the pond, where the training continues. Two young handlers are teaching fledglings to recognize specific call patterns, gentle whistles, bits of melody. One whistle, they say, means come home. Another means you're going the wrong way. Please stop scaring the monks. Nearby, a pair of elderly men are arguing about the optimal goose harness design. One swears by the double loop shoulder strap. The other claims it throws off the bird's balance unless lined with eel leather. You gather this has been an ongoing debate for approximately 47 years. And yet, it's all handled with a kind of sleepy reverence. No rush, no urgency. Just an unspoken understanding that what they're doing is somehow both absurd and profound. As the light slants lower in the sky, the steward offers you a seat beneath a plum tree. He's brought tea, earthy, floral, just the right temperature. He hands you a thin scroll, unrolled from the archive. This, he says, was sent from a poet to his friend across the valley. It's the oldest one we have that's still readable. You skim the lines. They're beautiful. Descriptions of mist rising from the fields, of the moon reflected in water pots, of a goose circling once before heading off into the blue. You realize in a quiet way that this has never really been about birds or letters. It's about longing, the human need to reach across distance, to say, I'm still here. Are you still there too? His steward nods, almost like he heard your thoughts. That's what kept it alive, he says. Even when empires fell, the geese still flew. The day is nearly gone now, and the golden light filters through layers of mist hanging above the riverbank. Somewhere overhead, a goose sails quietly, the breeze lifting her wings as if guided by ancient memory. You sip the last of your tea, lukewarm but still fragrant, and follow the steward once again, this time toward the village's outer boundary. This path, he tells you, was once part of the postal circuit itself. Not a formal one, no stone milestones or imperial flags, but a kind of unofficial shortcut used by messengers too impatient, or too late, to rely on geese alone. It snakes through bamboo groves and stumbles over flat stones worn smooth by centuries of tired feet. You pause by a strange wooden post. At first glance, it looks like a sign, but the text is carved sideways, vertically, almost hidden in the grain. It's a list: short names, odd symbols, and the occasional feather. Drop points, the steward explains, for when the geese didn't make it. Apparently, when weather turned or predators lurked, or a goose got distracted by, say, a particularly gossipy duck, messengers would retrieve the messages and finish the journey themselves. Backup plan, he adds. Han bureaucracy didn't mess around. That's the thing. For all its serenity, the Han Dynasty was relentless in its obsession with communication. Edicts, population registers, grain counts, and marriage records, nothing escaped the net of written oversight. And for far-flung settlements or military garrisons too isolated for horses, creativity became necessity. Even if that creativity involved strapping scrolls to waterfowl. You reach a mossy clearing where an old clay stele stands half buried in weeds. The characters are faded, but you can still make out the words Yunlu Ting, roughly Pavilion of Cloud Routes. This, it seems, was once a waypoint for messengers and their feathered colleagues. They'd rest here, eat boiled millet, wait for fog to lift, retie scrolls that had been chewed by curious hatchlings. Someone's left an offering, a carved wooden goose balanced on 3 smooth stones. There's even a scrap of parchment tied to its neck. You crouch to read it. To anyone who finds this, I hope you're well. I hope the stars are clear tonight. I hope the world has slowed enough to notice small things again. You blink. You hadn't realized how quiet it's become. The steward crouches beside you. People still leave notes, he says. It's tradition. You send something out, even if no one's there to receive it. That's how the old routes stay alive. You wonder aloud. Did the Han court know? Did the officials in Chang'an, buried in silks and tax ledgers, realize that somewhere deep in the southern provinces, farmers were handing scrolls to geese like they were trusted employees? Historians still argue whether these avian couriers were ever officially sanctioned, or whether the practice lived mostly in the margins, in villages too remote for inspection, or among communities who simply preferred their mail a little more honky. Still, goose imagery shows up in a surprising number of Han-era poems, murals, and even grave goods. One well-preserved tomb painting in Luoyang depicts a scene of a scholar tying a ribbon to a bird's leg beneath a cherry tree. Official records stay silent, but the art speaks. And isn't that the case so often in history? The gaps between ledgers and laws are filled with stories, rumors, soft traditions that whisper where empires shout. You begin the walk back with that in mind. The path glows faintly in the dusk. Crickets start their long evening symphony. A goose calls somewhere behind you, sharp, insistent, but oddly comforting. When you return to the village, it has changed. Not in structure, but in atmosphere. Lanterns swing gently from eaves, painting the walls with halos of amber light. Children chase shadows across the courtyard. A man tunes a 2-stringed erhu under a plum tree, the notes soft and watery. The flock is asleep now mostly, heads tucked under wings, bodies nestled into straw-lined baskets or wooden crates. A few geese remain awake, blinking at the moon as if composing quiet haikus. One of them, the freckled-beak messenger from earlier, waddles toward you. She stares for a long moment, then flops down in the dirt beside your feet, as if to say, "Long day. Let's not talk about it." You sit with her. A villager offers you a warm rice cake wrapped in lotus leaf. You accept it. There is no ceremony, just the slow rhythm of a world that hasn't rushed in centuries. And somewhere in a hollow reed hut nearby, a child carefully prepares tomorrow's message. He folds the parchment, dips his brush in ink, draws a tiny goose in the corner with exaggerated eyelashes. You smile. Even bureaucracy has its fan art. Final breeze rustles the reeds as the steward settles beside you with a clay jug of plum wine. "We don't really do this for the history books," he says quietly, "but for the stories, the silly ones, the whispered ones, the ones that matter at bedtime." You ask if the geese still get trained, or if it's all for show now. "Oh, they're still trained," he chuckles. "We just stopped pretending we're the ones in charge." The night deepens, folding gently over the village like a silk curtain, and the sounds around you soften. A distant owl hoots once, then changes its mind. The steward hands you a blanket stitched with faded clouds. Someone's old art project, perhaps, or a tribute to the cloud routes of goosemail lore. You pull it over your shoulders as he refills your cup. Your eyes drift toward a row of painted tiles set into the wall near the training enclosure. Each tile bears a goose, but no two are alike. One wears a scholar's cap. Another holds a scroll delicately in its beak. A third sports what can only be described as a distinctly imperial mustache. These are, the steward tells you, the honored couriers, a rotating gallery of the village's most trusted feathered veterans. You ask if there's any truth to the tale of Feather General Liu, a goose said to have completed 127 successful deliveries in a single season. The steward grins. "Ah, yes, Liu, half legend, half lap goose. But he's got a tile." It's in places like this that fact and folklore intermingle like tea leaves in hot water. You begin to see that the history of Han Dynasty goosemail isn't carved in stone, but written in warmth, passed down through sleepy rituals, hearthside reenactments, and the shared belief that something as humble as a goose might carry messages across mountains. The steward begins to speak softly now, as if matching the tempo of the breeze. "There's one story," he says, "that old Mr. Peng used to tell us when we were little, about a goose named Jade Feather trained by a retired palace scribe. He claimed she could read direction by scent, and was smart enough to peck once for military and twice for romantic nonsense." You snort into your cup. "Did she have opinions?" "Oh, very strong ones. Legend says she once refused to deliver a poem because the rhyme was lazy." These are the kinds of bedtime facts you didn't know you needed. Yet within the humor lies something deeper. Because Han-era literacy rates were still low for the common folk, messages were often short, simple, and pictographic. A symbol of a house for home, a moon for nightfall, a leaf for health. Some families developed their own private sign systems, unique enough to baffle outsiders but perfectly clear to those wading across rivers and valleys. One unearthed tablet even hints that certain village geese were trained to return only to hands bearing the scent of camphor oil, suggesting a kind of olfactory password system. Historians still argue whether this was genuine practice or poetic embellishment, though knowing what you do now about the feisty personalities of these birds, you wouldn't be surprised either way. You lean back and gaze upward. The stars overhead aren't bright exactly, but steady, burning with the patience of things that have nowhere else to be. A goose shifts in her crate nearby, feathers ruffling against straw. The sound is strangely lulling, like parchment being turned gently in a quiet archive. Beside you, the steward begins to hum. A song from his childhood, he says. A lullaby once sung by a grandmother who believed in both ghosts and government forms. You let the tune carry you, its melody lilting between major and minor, something halfway between joy and nostalgia. He explains that many villagers still write letters the old way, short notes wrapped around plum pits or pine needles, carried by geese not for speed but for sentiment. It's not about whether the message gets there, he muses. It's about letting it go. That, more than anything, seems to be the spirit of this peculiar tradition. A belief in trust over tracking, in effort over efficiency, in the small magic of sending something out into the world, uncertain of when or even if it will be received. You rise slowly, stretching your legs, and follow a narrow footpath illuminated by lanterns floating in shallow bowls of water. The light reflects upward, casting your face in soft gold. You come to a tiny pavilion overlooking a lotus pond. From here, you can just make out the faint silhouette of the training field, where a few shadowy goose figures still pace like tiny, feathery librarians doing last-minute shelf checks. The pond ripples as a carp breaks the surface, then disappears with a gulp. You sit on the edge, letting your fingers trail through the cool water. Somewhere nearby, someone is laughing. Quiet, not disruptive, but warm. Probably the children again, sneaking mooncakes from the pantry and blaming the birds. It's easy to imagine this village existing outside of time, as if the Han Dynasty never really ended here, just softened into legend. Not through grand monuments or bronze statues, but through gentle traditions, quietly absurd practices, and an unshakable fondness for waterfowl with a job to do. You turn to the steward with a half smile. Do any of the geese, fail the test? Oh, yes, he replies, not missing a beat. Some just aren't meant for letters. We had one who kept stealing jewelry instead of scrolls. Turned her into a local folk hero, the bandit of the bamboo shed. You both laugh softly, careful not to wake the sleeping flock. The wind rustles the reeds again. Somewhere above, a star shifts slightly, or maybe your vision does. You feel light, not weightless, but unburdened, like a sealed scroll finally out of your hands. As the steward rises to head back, you linger just a little longer. You know the way now. And besides, the geese will wait. The hour is late and the village has gone almost entirely still. Only the creak of bamboo and the rhythmic chirr of a night insects remain to anchor you to this place. You're not sure if you've been here for a few hours or for centuries. That's the kind of place this is, where time folds in on itself, like an origami letter being carried off by a goose. You wander through the inner courtyard again, half gliding now. Every lantern flicker, every cooling stone beneath your feet seems to whisper something forgotten. You pass by a training pen where a few young goslings snore softly, tiny heads tucked under wings. One lets out a high-pitched honk in its sleep, perhaps dreaming of glory in scroll delivery or bread theft. The steward reappears by your side holding a small bundle. He unties the string to reveal a letter, real parchment, delicately inked. You should write something, he says. Just a few lines, doesn't matter to whom. You hesitate, then kneel beside a low writing table and dip the brush. The ink smells faintly of plum blossoms and old tea. You scribble something simple, not profound, just real. Maybe even a little drowsy. You roll it carefully and hand it back. I know just the goose. He nods, whistling softly. A large white bird waddles from the shadows, head held high with the dignity of a bureaucrat and the swagger of a tavern bard. You half bow. She ignores you entirely, standard protocol. As your letter is fastened to her back in a tiny waterproof case, the steward tells you she's called Madame Featherstein. A joke name, obviously, bestowed by a homesick tax official from the Northern Territories. But the title stuck. She once delivered a wedding invitation and a resignation letter in the same trip, reportedly squawking once in offense before continuing dutifully onward. You watch as she disappears into the darkness, wings flapping steadily until she becomes a blur against the star-heavy sky. She's gone without hesitation. No GPS, no escort, just instinct, training, and a small note from someone who, just hours ago, wasn't even supposed to be here. There's a strange stillness in that moment, the kind that comes not from absence but from connection. You didn't shout your words into a void. You handed them gently to something ancient, ridiculous, and oddly trustworthy. Historians still argue whether these methods ever truly worked on a large scale. The imperial records are full of inconsistencies. Some reports suggest goose mail was a seasonal gimmick. Others claim it operated with military precision. Skeptics point to logistical issues, feather loss, message sabotage by rival geese, weather complications. Yet here, in this quiet village, that debate feels more academic than urgent. You pass by a hand-painted mural showing a goose wearing a tiny hat and bow tie, flanked by monks applauding. That one's purely decorative, the steward chuckles, though she was based on a real goose named Fan Fan who once accidentally delivered tax scrolls to a bridal party. It didn't go over well. It's these little errors, you think, the slips, the mistaken addresses, the occasional soggy scroll, that make the whole thing feel so wonderfully human. Or gooseman, as it were. You sit on the porch of the guest house now, legs tucked under you. In the distance, a bamboo chime tinkles lazily in the breeze. Someone is lighting incense, the kind that smells faintly like citrus and forgotten homework. You breathe in slowly, out even slower. Somewhere out there, Madame Featherstein is flying. Probably complaining to herself, but still flying. And you, just a visitor, a bystander in history's feathery footnote, are now part of that strange tradition. The Han Dynasty will never quite know your name, but one of its stories has made room for you. You smile, feeling the pull of sleep begin to settle behind your eyes. It's not the crashing sleep of exhaustion, but the kind that arrives like a gentle house guest. Slippers on, hands tucked behind their back, polite enough to ask if you've finished your tea before turning off the light. The steward gives one last bow. "Dream well," he says. "If you hear honking in your sleep, just remember, it's probably a love letter on the way." You laugh and close your eyes. And now, as the last stars wheel quietly overhead and the village of Goosemail fades into the warmth of memory, let your thoughts drift as softly as a feather on a summer breeze. You've wandered through bamboo corridors, shared plum wine with eccentric scribes, and watched letters take flight on the backs of birds with more opinions than some emperors. Let the sounds around you melt into the hush. Each honk, each rustle, each sleepy wing beat folding into the rhythm of your breath. There's nothing left to do tonight. No couriers to train, no scrolls to seal. Just the knowledge that somewhere out there, even the smallest message has a place to land. The ground beneath you is cool and steady. The air carries only softness. You are safe. You are held. And the geese, whether myth or memory, are on duty. Imagine your own message now, quiet, private, perhaps even wordless, tied gently to a ribbon, ready to float into the night. No urgency, no destination, just trust. And as it disappears beyond the mountains, carried on wings you don't have to see to believe in, allow your breath to deepen. Let your thoughts slow to a whisper. You've arrived, you're here, and everything else can wait until morning.